I want to return to what happened on much of the East Coast, not this past fall, but the year ago fall. We had what we call an oak mast, where the members of the red oak group all got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I stared at it. And I was rewarded. An insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First it chewed a little hole and forced its head through, and then forced its entire body through that little hole. It was a tight squeeze, kind of looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally plopped down. Now this is a dangerous time for this insect larva because a lot of things want to eat it. So it gets to safety by squirming and wiggling below the soil. It takes about 30 seconds, where it stretches in all directions and forms a little chamber. And then within that chamber, it converts itself to a pupa, and it stays there for 2 years. After 2 years comes out as an acorn weevil. This is what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think they have big noses, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down at the tip there. And they take those mouth parts and they chew a hole down into the center of the acorn, turn around, lay an egg in that hole, and that's how the larva gets into the acorn. Well, you might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the next year like most insects would? Because it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. And if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. That, of course, leaves a hole in the acorn, a true vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the vacated holes made by acorn weevils. And if they find a brand new acorn, they're excited because their old acorn's falling apart. So they tell everybody, time to move the colony, and they get busy. It takes about 30 minutes, but everybody carries an egg or a larva or something else into the new acorn. They post a guard here to make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. Well, about this time, my wife says, what's your point? What are you trying to tell us? What I'm trying to tell you is that is just one of literally millions of very specialized relationships that comprise most of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They grab acorn in the fall and they fly up to 2 miles away from the parent tree, then tap it below the surface of the ground. The idea is to get it again in the wintertime for food, but they forget where they put a lot of those acorns. And each jay ends up planting literally thousands of new oak trees every single year. But today, these relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to be mining the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, and he looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. The problem today, of course, is that we don't have the option of leaving most of the country as it was, because we haven't. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We've tilled it. We've drained it. We've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in the U.S., which is 4.5 times the size of Texas. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We've straightened our rivers. You might recognize this one, and dammed them. And you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We have drained our aquifers. We have introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents. In short, we have carved up the natural world into tiny remnants of its former self, and each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated from other such remnants to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. Why have we done that? Well, I guess we thought the earth was so big that we could, it's our nest. We could foul it forever without any consequences. And of course, we were wrong, and that's why we're seeing headlines like this at a pretty regular clip now. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. North America has lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of the North American bird population gone. And now the UN's predicting we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, possibly within the next 20 years. And I love the way they report this as if it's just another headline. They might as well say we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years and then go on to the next headline. It's not an option, folks. Losing this many species is simply not an option. Well, I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that's going to take small efforts from lots of people, but those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return to this headline briefly. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, the great E.O. Wilson, Edward O. Wilson, Harvard emeritus, probably the most famous biologist alive today, told us what it would mean if we were to lose our insects. And he did that way back in 1987 with this paper called The Little Things That Run the World. And his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if insects were to disappear, so would most of the flowering plants. And if most of the flowering plants disappeared, that would drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial habitats. So drastically that the food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, our mammals, and even many of our freshwater fish, they would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot, as opposed to right now we have insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients. But if we lost them, we just have bacteria and fungi to do that job. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. The good news is that doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the natural world because it's healthy ecosystems that produce what we call ecosystem services, the things that keep us alive. This is what plants deliver for us and everything else as well, like oxygen. They produce oxygen. That's pretty important. They clean water. They slow its journey to the sea where it's too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important these days. It's plants that are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, using the carbon in that molecule to build their tissues, and then they pump the extra carbon into the ground. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have deposited there over the eons. Plants build topsoil and hold it in place. They prevent floods. They dampen severe weather and many other things. What do animals do for plants? Well, they provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. Important thing. So designing landscapes like this that prevent the production of ecosystem services is simply not an option. It never was a good option, but today we've got 7.8, 7.9 billion people on the planet. We need more ecosystem services now than ever before. We can't afford to waste the earth in huge swaths like this. Now, there were visionaries through the ages that recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said was the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups that have learned how to do that pretty well. But our huge Western societies, our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely ruin an area. Then we move to another area, completely ruin that. And of course, Aldo Leopold recognized that is not a sustainable relationship with the earth. So he had a dream that we humans were actually capable of developing what he called a land ethic. In his dream, we would use land, we'd farm it, lumber it, graze, mine, do all the things we needed to do, but we'd learn to do it gently, without destroying local ecosystems. And that's what he called a land ethic. And he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he didn't talk about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, and it's still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have seen it as an option. But what I'm going to argue tonight is that living with nature not only is an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. You know, in the past, conservationists worked almost exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We now need to save nature, to reconstruct it really where we've dismantled it, where there are a lot of people, because that's most of the planet. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not just exist, but thrive. Where are we going to start? Well, let's go back to private property. 85.6% of the U.S. east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we ignored private property, we would fail because we wouldn't be working on nearly enough of the land. But there are a number of places where that could act as important conservation centers that we don't typically think of them as today. How about power and pipeline rights-of-ways? There's 21 million acres in power and pipeline rights-of-ways. Another 3 million acres in railroad rights-of-ways, and another 17 million acres in roadsides. We've got 2 million acres of golf courses, 3 million acres of airports. You know, the Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. These are huge areas. Then we have all the places where we live, both in rural areas and suburbia and our cities, hundreds of millions of acres in those types of landscapes. So that's 599 million acres if you add it up, where we're really not doing conservation, but we could be. How big is 599 million acres? Well, it's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, California, Texas combined. So not having a place to do conservation is not the issue. We've got plenty of places we can do conservation. What I'm really talking about is rebuilding nature in the areas where we've dismantled it. But in order to do that, we have to start with the building blocks of nature, the species that are most important, the species that other species depend on. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally, so we have to start with the most important ones. And two of the most important groups are right here. We've got the flowering plants, which we've decided we need, but you're not going to have them without the pollinators to keep those plants around. It's those plants that are capturing the energy from the sun and turning it into food, which is now in their leaves. But if we don't get that food from the leaves of the plants to animals, it's stuck in the leaves, and that there is no food web, no animals around. And most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants, and that something typically is insects. But it turns out that the insects that are transferring more energy to animals than any other type of plant eater are caterpillars. Caterpillars are essential to viable terrestrial food webs. So if we design landscapes without caterpillars, most of the energy remains locked up in the leaves, and you don't have a viable food web. Let's use the Carolina chickadee as an example. They are seed eaters during the wintertime. At least 50% of their diet is seeds, and that's why we see them at our feeders so often. But when it comes time to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds. It's very common in our birds. Babies cannot eat seeds, so the chickadees switch to insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars, and they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars.